Yes, hello and welcome to Night Moves with Devin Seeger. This is a podcast that I figured I'd just mess around and try doing. I like reading stuff and talking about things, and I figured with the quarantine, what better time to mess around with something like this than now? Um, Night Moves will be a podcast based around different forms of literature and art, and then talking about it. Sometimes I'll probably want to have some of my friends on, some guests who may want to discuss things with me, which I think should be pretty fun. The first episode we're going to do today is actually reading Ray Bradbury's short story, The Last Night of the World. Ray Bradbury was an American author who is most known for his book Fahrenheit 451. I thought it was interesting. I was reading a bit of his biography on biography.com, of course. Um, and it said that Ray Bradbury actually rejected being called a science fiction author because he believed his work was based on the fantastical and the unreal, which I thought was kind of interesting because most people, when they think about Ray Bradbury and think about Fahrenheit 451, I think most people would label him as a science fiction author. So I thought that that was interesting. Um, but I guess I'll just hop in and start reading the story. This was originally published in the February 1951 issue of Esquire, and it is titled The Last Night of the World. So here we go. What would you do if you knew this was the last night of the world? What would I do? You mean seriously? Yes, seriously. I don't know. I hadn't thought. She turned the handle of the silver coffee pot toward him and placed the two cups in their saucers. He poured some coffee. In the background, the two small girls were playing blocks on the parlor rug in the light of the green hurricane lamps. There was an easy, clean aroma of brewed coffee in the evening air. Well, better start thinking about it, he said. You don't mean it, said his wife. He nodded. A war? He shook his head. Not the hydrogen or atom bomb? No. Or germ warfare? None of those at all, he said, stirring his coffee slowly and staring into its black depths. But just the closing of a book, let's say. I don't think I understand. No, nor do I, really. It's just a feeling. Sometimes it frightens me. Sometimes I'm not frightened at all, but peaceful. He glanced in at the girls and their yellow hair shining in the bright lamplight and lowered his voice. I didn't say anything to you. It first happened about 4 nights ago. What? A dream I had. I dreamt that it was all going to be over, and a voice said it was. Not any kind of voice I can remember, but a voice anyway. And it said things would stop here on Earth. I didn't think too much about it when I awoke the next morning, but then I went to work, and the feeling was with me all day. I caught Stan Willis looking out the window in the middle of the afternoon, and I said, Penny for your thoughts, Stan? And he said, I had a dream last night. And before he even told me the dream, I knew what it was. I could have told him, but he told me and I listened to him. It was the same dream? Yes. I told Stan I had dreamed it too. He didn't seem surprised. He relaxed, in fact. Then we started walking through offices, for the hell of it. It wasn't planned. We didn't say, let's look around. We just walked on our own. And everywhere we saw people looking at their desks, or their hands, or out the windows, and not seeing what was in front of their eyes. I talked to a few of them. So did Stan. And all of them had dreamed? All of them. The same dream, with no difference. Do you believe in the dream? Yes. I've never been more certain. And when will it stop? The world, I mean. Sometime during the night for us. And then, as the night goes on around the world, those advancing portions will go too. It'll take 24 hours for it all to go. They sat a while, not touching their coffee. Then they lifted it slowly and drank, looking at each other. Do we deserve this? She said. It's not a matter of deserving. It's just that things didn't work out. I noticed you didn't even argue about this. Why not? I guess I have a reason, she said. The same reason everyone at the office had? She nodded. I didn't want to say anything. It happened last night. And the women on the block are talking about it, just among themselves. She picked up the evening paper and held it toward him. There's nothing in the news about it. No. Everyone knows, so what's the need? He took the paper and sat back in his chair, looking at the girls and then at her. Are you afraid? No. Not even for the children. I always thought I would be frightened to death, but I'm not. Where's that spirit of self-preservation the scientists talk about so much? I don't know. You don't get too excited when you feel things are logical. This is logical. Nothing else but this could have happened from the way we've lived. We haven't been too bad, have we? No, nor enormously good. I suppose that's the trouble. We haven't been very much of anything except us, while a big part of the world was busy being lots of quite awful things. The girls were laughing in the parlor as they waved their hands and tumbled down their house of blocks. I always imagined people would be screaming in the streets at a time like this. I guess not. You don't scream about the real thing. Do you know, I won't miss anything but you and the girls. I never liked cities or autos or factories or my work or anything else except you three. I won't miss a thing except my family and perhaps the change in the weather and a glass of cool water when the weather's hot, or the luxury of sleeping. Just little things, really. How can we sit here and talk this away? Because there's nothing else to do. That's it, of course, for if there were, we'd be doing it. I suppose this is the first time in history of the world that everyone has really known just what they were going to be doing during the last night. I wonder what everyone else will do now, this evening, for the next few hours. Go to a show, listen to the radio, watch the TV, play cards, put the children to bed, get to bed themselves like always. In a way, that's something to be proud of, like always. We're not all bad. They sat a moment, and then he poured more coffee. Why do you suppose it's tonight? Because. Why not some night in the 10 years past of in the last century? Or 5 years ago? Or 5 centuries ago? Or 10? Maybe it's because it was never February 30th, 1951, ever before in history. And now it is, and that's it. Because this date means more than any other date ever meant, and because it's the year when things are as they are all over the world, and that's why it's the end. There are bombers on their course both ways across the ocean tonight that'll never see land again. That's part of the reason why. Well, he said, what shall it be? Wash the dishes? They washed the dishes carefully and stacked them away with a special neatness. At 8:30 the girls were put to bed and kissed good night, and the little lights by their beds turned on, and the door left a trifle open. I wonder, said the husband, coming out and looking back, standing there with his pipe for a moment. What? If the door should be shut all the way, or if it should be left just a little ajar so we can hear them if they call. I wonder if the children know, if anyone mentioned anything to them. No, of course not. They'd have asked us about it. They sat and read the papers and talked and listened to some radio music, and then sat together by the fireplace looking at the charcoal embers as the clock struck 10:30 and 11 and 11:30. They thought of all the other people in the world who had spent their evening each in their own special way. Well, he said at last. He kissed his wife for a long time. We've been good for each other, anyway. Do you want to cry? He asked. I don't think so. They went through the house and turned out the lights and locked the doors and went into the bedroom and stood in the night-cool darkness undressing. She took the spread from the bed and folded it carefully over a chair, as always, and pushed back the covers. The sheets are so cool and clean and nice, she said. I'm tired. We're both tired. They got into bed and lay back. Wait a moment, she said. He heard her get up and go out into the back of the house, and then he heard the soft shuffling of a swinging door. A moment later she was back. I left the water running in the kitchen, she said. I turned the faucet off. Something about this was so funny that he had to laugh. She laughed with him, knowing what it was that she had done that was so funny. They stopped laughing at last and lay in their cool night bed, their hands clasped, their heads together. Good night, he said after a moment. Good night, she said, adding softly, dear. And that's the end of the story. I think this is a super interesting idea. Maybe not an idea, and maybe interesting is a terrible word to use. I like this because Ray Bradbury has such a way of setting such a tone and visuals and really puts you in the imagery of this. I think everyone can imagine getting into bed at night when you're really tired, when the sheets feel really cool and clean, and how good that must feel. I think it's interesting that he chose to portray humans as not being out in the streets and doing stuff if they all knew that this was going to be their last night alive. I find that a super interesting. I keep saying interesting. I should stop saying that. Me and Charles were complaining about that word the other day, I do believe. I don't know that I agree that if everyone had a dream where they were told that this would be the last night of their lives, that they wouldn't be going crazy in some sort of way. I mean, I guess if you think this is back in the 50s, maybe stuff was a little different if Bradbury's writing from his time and stuff like that. But especially with all the stuff going on now, I think this is an interesting story to read. An interesting, good one there. I think it fits because with the COVID-19 thing going on, um, I think that a lot of people are very uncertain about how things are going to go, and I don't think that anyone thinks the world's going to end. But I find it funny that this is the story I came across to read um, today. I was expecting Bradbury to give some kind of insight on how the world was going to die or something like that, but I guess it maybe makes more sense that it ends with both of them just saying goodnight. Um, I love the idea of people being content knowing that this was the last night of their lives and they spent it doing just about whatever they would have been doing any other night. Um, I liked the end where she goes, "I left the water running in the kitchen." She said, "I turned the faucet off." Because it doesn't really tell you why that it was funny or why they thought that it was so funny. But my idea would be that what does it matter if you left the faucet on if this is the last night of the world? Um, I guess it worried her so much. She's so used to it that she did it like she would any other night. I think that's one of the biggest themes in this is just that, like, if you knew the world was going to end, what can you really do? It seems a little weird how applicable it is to this COVID-19 pandemic. Everyone, in a way, has this overnight realization that everything has changed. Yeah, that's an interesting. I Oh my God, Charles, I'm gonna give you a buzzer for every time I do this podcast. Oh, my audio just duplicated there. I apologize. Um, every time I see interesting, I want Charles to hit the shock collar, man. But Parks, I think that's a good point. Um, it was funny that this is the story, like I said, that I came across. Seeing how people ask Buzz, yeah. Um, I don't know. I guess if anyone here is in chat, I see Oseas was here, Parks, Charles. What do you guys think? Do you think that if everyone in the world had a dream that tomorrow was going to be the last night of the world, do you think that everyone would just kind of be content in it? What do you think? I like this line here. Where's that spirit of self-preservation that scientists talk about so much? If everyone in the world had the same dream that the world was going to end, how hard would people try to actually keep it from happening, you know? This line, I guess not. You don't scream about the real thing. My first thought is that I don't have enough time to react to it. Would people talk about it? So not much would really change personally. Charles, I think that's an interesting question. Would people talk about it? If I had a dream tonight that a voice told me the world was going to end tomorrow, would I go and talk to people about it? Would I even give heed to a dream like that? I think the only way I would ever give that dream any attention is if somebody were to come up to me and tell me about their dream. The minute you learn that someone else had the same exact dream as you, I think that it gets a little weird. Um, but Parks brings up a good point that with social media, I think people would talk about it. And over the course of the day, everyone would realize they all had it. Yeah, that's so. I'm just trying to imagine this happening. And it seems like. I just find it interesting that this is the way. I said interesting again. Um, I'd like to know why Bradbury chose this kind of setting and way to tell the story. It's a bit sad with the two parents just kind of sitting there, knowing that the world's going to end, watching their daughters. Maybe there's something kind of serene about that moment that they're just sitting there and they just go to bed like any other night. Um, Charles says, I think about how people in other countries would feel. After all, tonight is tomorrow to them. Huh. The end of the world can be a prophetic event. Well, I mean, in some religions, yes, for sure. If you think about, like, not that I'm an expert on religion, but God coming down and basically creating a new world. I wonder, it'd be fun to think about, like, imagine people being out the next day knowing they all had the same dream. And it would totally be like, Parks, if you remember from Acura, um, the people who believed Akira was the god and they were out in the streets and believed that he was there to save them. Um, I actually think that's a good parallel to draw there. Maybe it was the last night of the world, everyone would go to church. See, that's a good point, Parks. Um, I always thought that if people knew that the world was going to end, how many people would try to convert to some kind of religion to maybe save themselves in the end? Um, Kind of like, oh, well, maybe I never believed in religion, but I could try if I know that I'm going to die. What's the point? And I think an underlying theme of this story is in the line where he goes, "Do you know I won't miss anything but you and the girls? I never liked cities or autos or factories or my work or anything else except you three. I won't miss a thing except my family and perhaps the change in the weather and a cool glass of water when the weather's hot, or the luxury of sleeping. Just little things, really. How can we sit here and talk this way?" I think that Bradbury really likes to focus on the little things. I think that's what makes this scene of this mother and father, I'm assuming, talking about the end of the world kind of just as it is just a thing. And the idea that it's happening because it's never been this day before. He says maybe it's because it was never February 30th, 1951, ever before in history, and now it is, and that's it. Because for some reason this date means more than any other date ever meant, and because it's the year when things are as they are all over the world, and that's why it's the end. Devil. Oops, hang on. Devil's advocate? What's your devil's advocate, Parks? I definitely don't think, especially nowadays, that people would be so calm about it. Devil's advocate, what if they all woke up the next day in spite of the dream they had? I think the last night is not happening. He just thinks it. Hmm. So what? I wonder if that would be maybe the idea that if everyone knew that the world was ending and the only thing they realized they would ever miss were maybe some of the little things and realized how much they hated maybe the hustle and bustle of going to work or all that stuff. An interesting thought experiment would be how would people react if they knew that they were going to die tomorrow? How would people act the day before? And if they woke up the next day and nobody had actually died, do you think anyone would actually change their habits or the ways that they do things? And that's more of a question about does the fear of death change people as much as we think it does? Borhamika said he would celebrate. You would celebrate if you woke up the next day and nobody died? I mean, yeah, there are definitely some people who would just want to celebrate. Like, yeah, let's have a party in the streets. Nobody died. I was thinking as I read this story that maybe they were going to wake up and not die. Um, some would say fear is the most powerful emotion. Yeah, that's actually Parks. Funny you bring that up. The anime that I was talking about the other night called Death Parade. They say that fear is the most in the show. I think she said that fear is the most primal and most powerful emotion that humans can experience, and the world is what we perceive. Yeah, but I like this story. I can't believe I'd never read it before. I guess what we could actually do is I could read another short story. I have a few other ones lined up. If anybody would want to hear something else. So the last night of the world would be the same for him or for everyone. Me and Ryan Turner actually like to talk about this idea a lot. That the world is what we perceive, right? And we were talking about the idea of actions and how someone should act, right? And Ryan had made a point that if the world is what I perceive and the world Ryan knows is really different from any other world that we know, Ryan was arguing, if I remember correctly, that if he lived his life doing whatever he wanted and died, right? What did anything he do matter once he dies? Because the world just stops existing for Ryan. whether or not he goes to heaven or hell, or whether we just kind of turn off like a machine or the batteries had died in something. Like at that point, has the world ever existed? And the world that Ryan knew will never be known by anyone else. And his idea was that why do my actions matter if at the end of the day I die and the world that I knew stops existing? Which I think is only works if you say like even someone like the most obvious example would be like, yeah, exactly. That's what I told him. I said that, but the world is always moving forward. So even if he dies, the world continues going. But his argument was that simply, why does he care that the world is always changing if the world ends for him when he dies? Ryan Butler said, see, that's the thought that keeps me up at night. I mean, that is the thought that keeps people up at night. I think it's interesting. Because obviously, someone like Martin Luther King, right? He died, but everything that he did and worked for has always, it's always there. It continues with the rest of the world. Um, Afterlife. Well, the afterlife is a whole nother conversation. I believe when me and Ryan were talking, he was talking about the idea of an afterlife not existing, kind of just we just end, um, and nothing after that. Afterlife would be a whole nother. Well, then the argument of an afterlife existing would be the whole argument of why you should act in a certain way because you want to get to the afterlife. Now, maybe other people don't care about it, but if you know, that, even, I guess even if you have faith in an afterlife, then it matters. But for someone like Ryan, say, someone who's agnostic, doesn't believe in religion or an afterlife, his argument was what reason do I have to act in a certain way besides my own kind of rules or restrictions, right? It's like the world is only what Ryan has ever known. Park says something I thought was interesting in my storytelling lecture recently was how one of the reasons writers write is because they seek immortality. I've never thought about it that way, but I mean, you're completely right. I mean, think about it. Ray Bradbury wrote this in 1951, and here we are reading it on a Twitch stream and talking about it, which is super cool. Then he only has one chance at life, then, no? Yeah, that's a good point, Charles. Um, since the world is only what he has ever known it, and he only has one chance at it, why would he not do it to the best of his ability? But I think that eh, maybe an underlying problem with that be like with that argument would be, oh, you only have one life, but like that's quite literally like YOLO, right? Like do whatever you want. You only have one chance at living. Um, but I definitely think that writing. I don't know that I've ever thought an author was like when an author writes. I never imagine that their first thought is I want to write something to become immortal. But I definitely think authors have reached some sort of level of immortality through the things that they read. Park says life is pretty freaking long. Charles said, nah, dude, just because March took a year to end. Yeah, that's true. I don't know. Does anyone want to hear me read another story for this while you're all here? Because that first story wasn't too long. We have a few here I could read. Um, what could we read here? Go ahead, son. Shoot. Okay. Do we want to hear? What do we want to hear? Do we want to hear A Clean, Well-Lighted Place by Ernest Hemingway? Do we want to read something from Margaret Atwood? Or um, The Looking Glass by Anton Chekhov? The father of the modern short story, writing with a style that yielded to his characters rather than vice versa. In The Looking Glass, a woman feverishly attempts to seek help for her husband, sick with typhus, but is met with a surprise. This sounds kind of interesting. It also sounds a little topical. Um, Maybe we'll give this one a try, huh? If the story would load here, I could read it. Let's see if I can look it up. The Looking Glass. Anton. This is, I think, more of like closer to like a 5-minute short story. The Looking Glass. Here we go. Okay, so we're gonna read *The Looking Glass* by Anton Chekhov. I think I'm saying that right. Um, so here we go. New Year's Eve. Nellie, the daughter of a landowner and general, a young and pretty girl, dreaming day and night of being married, was sitting in her room, gazing with exhausted, half-closed eyes into the looking-glass. She was pale, tense, and as motionless as the looking-glass. The non-existent but apparent vista of a long, narrow corridor with endless rows of candles, the reflection of her face, her hands, of the frame, all this was already clouded in mist, and merged into a boundless gray sea. The sea was undulating, gleaming and now and then flaring crimson. Looking at Nellie's motionless eyes and parted lips, one could hardly say whether she was asleep or awake, but nevertheless she was seeing. At first she only saw the smile and soft, charming expression of someone's eyes. Then against the shifting gray background there gradually appeared the outlines of a head, a face, eyebrows, beard. It was he, the destined one, the object of long dreams and hopes. The destined one was for Nellie everything, the significance of life, personal happiness, career, fate. Outside him, as on the gray background of the looking glass, all was dark, empty, meaningless. And so it was not strange that seeing before her a handsome, gently smiling face, she was conscious of bliss, of an unutterably sweet dream that could not be expressed in speech or on paper. Then she heard his voice, saw herself living under the same roof with him. Her life merged into his. Months and years flew by against the gray background, and Nellie saw her future distinctly in all its details. Picture followed picture against the gray background. Now Nellie saw herself one winter night knocking at the door of Stepan Lukich, the district doctor. The old dog hoarsely and lazily barked behind the gate. The doctor's windows were in darkness. All was silence. For God's sake, whispered Nellie. But at the last garden gate creaked, and Nellie saw the doctor's cook. Is the doctor home? His honor's asleep, whispered the cook into her sleeve, as though afraid of waking her master. He's only just got home from his fever patients and gave orders he was not to be waked. But Nellie scarcely heard the cook. Thrusting her aside, she rushed headlong into the doctor's house. Running through some dark and stuffy rooms, upsetting 2 or 3 chairs, she at last reached the doctor's bedroom. Stepan Lukich, I guess we'll just say. Stepan Lukich was lying on his bed, dressed but without his coat, and with pouting lips was breathing into his open hand. A little nightlight glimmered faintly beside him. Without uttering a word, Nellie sat down and began to cry. She wept bitterly, shaking all over. "My husband is ill," she sobbed out. Stepan Lukich was silent. He slowly sat up, propped his head on his hand, and looked at his visitor with fixed, sleepy eyes. "My husband is ill," Nellie continued, restraining her sobs. "For mercy's sake, come quickly. Make haste, make haste." Growled the doctor, blowing into his hand. Come this very minute, or it's terrible to think, for mercy's sake." And pale, exhausted Nellie, gasping and swallowing her tears, began describing to the doctor her husband's illness, her unutterable terror. Her sufferings would have touched the heart of a stone, but the doctor looked at her, blew into his open hand, and not a movement. "I'll come tomorrow," he uttered. "That's impossible," cried Nellie. "I know my husband has typhus. At once, this very minute, you are needed." "I have only just come in," muttered the doctor. "For the last 3 days I've been away, seeing typhus patients, and I'm exhausted and ill myself. I simply can't. Absolutely. I've caught it myself. There." And the doctor thrust before her eyes a clinical thermometer. "My temperature is nearly 40. I absolutely can't. I can scarcely sit up. Excuse me. I'll lie down." The doctor lies down. "But I implore you, doctor," Nellie moaned in despair. "I beseech you, help me for mercy's sake. Make a great effort and come. I will repay you, doctor." "Oh, dear, why, I have told you already. Ah!" Nellie leapt up and walked nervously up and down the bedroom. She longed to explain to the doctor, to bring him to reason. She thought if only he knew how dear her husband was to her, and how unhappy she was, he would forget his exhaustion and his illness. But how could she be eloquent enough? "Go to the Semstvo, doctor," she heard Stepan Lukich's voice. That's impossible. He lives more than 20 miles from here, and time is precious, and the horses can't stand it. It is 30 miles from us to you, and as much from here to the Zemstvo, doctor. No, it's impossible. Come along, Stepan Lukich. I ask of you an heroic deed. Come perform that heroic deed. Have pity on us. It's beyond everything. I'm in a fever. My head's in a whirl, and she won't understand. Leave me alone. But you are in duty bound to come. You cannot refuse to come. It's egoism. A man is bound to sacrifice his life for his neighbor, and you refuse to come. I will summon you before the court. Nellie felt that she was uttering a false and undeserved insult, but for her husband's sake she was capable of forgetting logic, tact, sympathy for others. In reply to her threats, the doctor greedily gulped a glass of cold water. Nellie fell to entreating and imploring like the very lowest beggar. At the last the doctor gave way. He slowly got up, puffing and panting, looking for his coat. "Here it is," cried Nellie, helping him. "Let me put it on you. Come along. I will repay you. All my life I shall be grateful to you." But what agony! After putting on his coat, the doctor lay down again. Nellie got him up and dragged him into the hall. Then there was an agonizing to-do over his galoshes, his overcoat. His cap was lost. But at last Nellie was in the carriage with the doctor. Now they had only to drive 30 miles, and her husband would have a doctor's help. The earth was wrapped in darkness. One could not see one's hand before one's face. A cold winter was blowing. There were frozen lumps under their wheels. The coachman was continually stopping and wondering which road to take. Nellie and the doctor sat silent all the way. It was fearfully jolting, but they felt neither the cold nor the joints. Get on, Nellie implored the driver. At 5 in the morning, the exhausted horses drove into the yard. Nellie saw the familiar gates, the well with the crane, the long row of stables and barns. At last she was home. "Wait a moment, I will be back directly," she said to Stepan Lukich, making him sit down on the sofa in the dining room. "Sit still and wait a little, and I'll see how he was going on." On her return from her husband, Nellie found the doctor lying down. He was lying on the sofa and muttering. "Doctor, please, doctor!" Ask Domna, muttered Stepan Lukich. "What?" "They said at the meeting. Vlasov said." "Who?" "What?" And to her horror, Nellie saw that the doctor was as delirious as her husband. What was to be done? "I must go for the Zemstvo, doctor," she decided. Then again there followed darkness, a cutting cold wind, lumps of frozen earth. She was suffering in body and in soul, and delusive nature has no arts, no deceptions to compensate these sufferings. Then she saw against the gray background how her husband every spring was in straits for money to pay the interest for the mortgage to the bank. He could not sleep. She could not sleep. And both racked their brains till their heads ached, thinking how to avoid being visited by the clerk of the court. She saw her children. The everlasting apprehension of colds, scarlet fever, diphtheria, bad marks at school, separation. Out of a brood of 5 or 6, one was sure to die. The gray background was not untouched by death. That might well be. A husband and wife cannot die simultaneously. Whatever happened, one must bury the other. And Nellie saw her husband dying. This terrible event presented itself to her in every detail. She saw the coffin, the candles, the deacon, and even the footmarks in the hall made by the undertaker. What is it for?" she asked, looking blankly at her husband's face. And all the previous life with her husband seemed to her a stupid prelude to this. Something fell from Nellie's hand and knocked on the door. She started, jumped up, and opened her eyes wide. One looking-glass she saw lying at her feet. The other was standing as before on the table. She looked into the looking-glass and saw a pale, tear-stained face. There was no gray background now. "I must have fallen asleep," she thought with a sigh of relief. That was The Looking-Glass by Anton Chekhov. I actually don't know too much about this guy. I do believe he's Russian, which is why the doctor's name was a little weird for me to read. That story seemed a little more cryptic than Ray Bradbury's The Last Night of the World. I'm not necessarily sure if I completely understand the reason for Chekhov writing this story, although I've never really heard much about it. Um, so Nellie falls asleep and dreams of a life where she meets a very nice man and she's happy, but then she dreams of a horrible fate where her husband gets sick, one of her children will die, and then they all end up getting sick with diphtheria and other things. The doctor makes his way to the house. He becomes delirious. And then she wakes up. Huh. That was an interesting one. I'm not sure that I have too much like opinion on this story. I don't really know how I'm supposed to feel about it. I mean, it definitely says something about the human condition, and being helpless in a situation like that. Your husband's dying, and the only person you can rely on is a doctor who is also sick and has been helping lots of other people that day already. It seems like this definitely is maybe not dystopian, but obviously it takes place in um, a much earlier time where they ride carriages. Um, I guess this story really just makes you feel kind of hopeless. This woman's trying everything to get her husband to feel better and to make sure that he lives. And then the author throws this main character, Nellie, a bunch of reasons why, like how miserable their life's going to be even if she saves him or gets him help. She was suffering in body and in soul, and delusive nature has no arts, no deceptions to compensate these sufferings. That might be a good sentence there, um, to think about. Being absolutely helpless, what do you do? And we were talking earlier about fear kind of being a driving human emotion. And earlier in the story, it says that Nellie lost all reason and logic and care for others because she was so worried about her husband. I think that that's pretty. I think that that's not a weird thing to happen in the story. I think that happens to a lot of people. Fear for our loved ones and for our lives will make us do a lot of things, I believe. But other than that, I'm not sure how I really feel about Looking Glass or what it should be doing for me. I don't know if anyone else has anything to say on this short story. I thought the writing was really good, and I got a good picture of the setting, and it did that for me. But I didn't get as much out of the story as I got from Ray Bradbury's The Last Night of the World. But yeah, I definitely would like to read some more short stories. I'll probably continue this. I'd like to do some poetry, read some Walt Whitman for sure. Um, Earlier, we were talking to Charles and Parks in the chat and some other of my friends. Definitely like to have people on to talk about stuff like this. And I don't know, just have good conversation. Give us something to read and do um, during this quarantine. But that was a lot of fun. If anyone has anything they'd like to talk about or like me to touch on, I'd appreciate it. I thank you for watching this very short stream. If anyone has anything they'd like me to watch or read right now, I would be more than willing to read something else. Um, but yeah, I appreciate you guys coming in and listening to me talk for, I don't know, 38 minutes. Oh, if you guys see this wonderful image here, Night Moves with Devin Seeger, you can thank my friend Oseas for the idea of naming the podcast Night Moves, the album by Bob Seger. Have these discussions at night. It's currently 8 o'clock, so it's getting pretty dark out. But thank you to Parks for hitting me with this awesome design that I helped him figure out and kind of the theme we wanted to do. But yeah, this has been The Last Night of the World. Night Moves with Devin Seeger. I'll see you all later, and thanks for stopping by.